We received a letter recently from a family in Detroit. There are 3 children in the family, and the little boy, Ralphie, is aged 5. And sometimes he's a little bad, and whenever the mother reprimands him, he always says to her, "Mother, will you give me another chance?" "Surely," said the mother. And this particular Saturday, the mother went to confession, and she took little Ralph with her. When she came out of the confessional box and knelt down in the pew alongside of Ralph to say her penance, Ralph said, "Did God give you another chance?" Tonight we're going to take you on a tour to Paris. Most Americans see a great deal in Paris, and then there are some, that can see no value at all in Europe. I really and truly heard of an American who, when he came to Switzerland, told a friend of mine in Switzerland, "I haven't seen anything in Europe that's worthwhile. All the buildings are old, and even the art is ancient. No modern art of any kind." And this friend of mine in Switzerland said, "Well, what do you think about Switzerland? Isn't it beautiful?" And he said, "Well, take away the scenery, and what have you got left?" Well, tonight we take you to the city of Paris. Paris originally was on an island, and we'll show you a picture of that little island as it looks today. It's called the Ile de Cité. It looks like a ship that was sunk into the Seine. And that little island was called Lutetia, the White City. And it was there that Paris took its origin. It is said that because the island looked like a boat, par, that Paris itself derived its name. And it was only later on that Paris began to swell out to either banks of the Seine. Now, on this particular island, the Druids built an altar. They dedicated it to their gods, and they also dedicated an altar to the Virgin who would bring forth a son. Then later on, when Julius Caesar came and conquered Gaul, remember Julius Caesar, all Gaul is divided into 3 parts. He afterwards built there on that same island an altar to Jupiter. And then when Christianity began to come into Gaul, or what is now France, the first apostle who came there by the name of Denis built a church in honor of St. Stephen, and built it on the island and on the spot where once the Druids had an altar, where once the Romans had an altar to Jupiter. And then this old church, St. Stephen, continued to stand on that island until the year 538, when another church was built alongside of it. But it was not dedicated to St. Stephen. The Eastern world was then showing great devotion to the one that they called Theotokos, Mother of God. And so the Western world decided to build a church in honor of Our Lady, Notre Dame. And in 538, alongside of this old church of St. Stephen, was constructed the church of Notre Dame. In 1128, 600 years later, he was born in the Loire section of France, a child by the name of Maurice de Sully. Came up to Paris to study. He was a peasant boy. And he studied at that church of Notre Dame because the original University of Paris was around the portals of Notre Dame. That's where the students used to gather. It was there the philosophers taught. Someday on television we may tell you about a very famous teacher who taught there and looked out at someone holding the hand of a little 2 or 3 year old girl. One of the most interesting stories of the Middle Ages. And he was also often in the library. In those days, a book cost just as much as a house did. And the greatest library in France was at the Cathedral of Notre Dame. Maurice de Sully became a great preacher. So very famous that he was known all over Europe. And some of his sermons today exist in the Bodleian Library at Oxford, England. And finally, he was named the Bishop of Paris. And he succeeded. And everyone who knows philosophy in the audience will recall immediately the name of the great philosopher whom he succeeded, Peter Lombard. And after his consecration, he came back to Paris, and here was this old church. It was not large enough. Paris was a big city. 50,000 people in Paris in those days. And these two churches were not large enough for the throngs. He decided to build a church that would be big enough for everyone in the city. And so when he came back after his consecration, he took his crozier and he went out around that aisle, that Ile de Cité, and he made marks all around the island. And when he had finished those marks, he said, that will be the site of the new Cathedral of Notre Dame. He reigned for 36 years, and he practically saw it completed. It took only 70 years to build. And this cathedral, well, let us show you first of all some pictures. Here is the Cathedral of Notre Dame alongside of the Seine today, on the site of the old Druid altar. This is the cathedral illuminated at night. The front door of the cathedral. And the dimensions? The cathedral was 434 feet long. It was 124 feet wide. The towers of the cathedral were 223 feet high. Up until 1931, there was not a single bridge in New York City that was as high as the Tower of Notre Dame, built 700 years ago. Inside of the cathedral, 7,700,000 cubic feet. This is the interior of the cathedral. The side view of the arches and the rose window. We will speak of that in a moment. In those days, there was a kind of a fever of building. Within a radius of 150 miles of Paris, and incidentally, all the distances from Paris, even to this day, are measured not by the distance from the Arc de Triomphe or from the Opera. All distances in Paris are measured from Notre Dame and to Notre Dame. I say there was a great fever of building. There were 50 cathedrals, many of them almost about the size of Notre Dame, like Rheims, Chartres, Lyon, that were built in France. 500 churches in addition to the 50 cathedrals. And what was it that inspired the people in those days to throw these great piles of stone into the air? Faith, certainly. As Ralph Adams Cram said, we could not build cathedrals like that today simply because we do not have the faith. But in the natural order, there was something else. Men were always fond of building towers. Hence the Tower of Babel was a dedication to a humanism that was anti-God. The Greeks used to build their towers and their monuments to honor their philosophers and their dramatists. The Greeks in order to honor their generals. The American builds towers to honor American enterprise. But these towers and these great piles of stone were erected for only one purpose, namely to glorify God. And the people who built them They had a dual nature. First of all, they were deeply sensitive, passionate, almost primitive. And on the other hand, they were keenly intellectual. Reason reached a higher peak in those days than it did at any other time in the history of the world, with the exception of the 5th century before Christ. And when you get a combination of this deep, passionate nature, allied to a flashing intelligence, you create a tension which can really beget cathedrals and other works of art. As one architect of the 20th century said in those days, they never made a mistake in their works of art. And then in addition to this inspiration, there was the fact that many of them were coming back from the Crusades. They had seen the great architecture of the Byzantine periods. They'd also derived considerable inspiration from Islam. But at any rate, this became one of the great showplaces of the world, where 12,500 people could worship at one time. And many interesting things and events took place in there. First of all, here's the beautiful rose window, and we'll tell you a story about the rose window. This rose window has at the center a picture of image of Notre Dame. Now there was also, in addition to the glazier who made this window, a sculptor who made the gargoyles. The gargoyles are those horrid little demons that peer out from behind pillars and so forth to remind you that even in church there are temptations. And the gargoyle maker looked very much like his gargoyles. He was a very ugly sort of individual, and of course he fell in love with the beautiful wife of the maker of the Madonna window. Well, gossip got around. And finally, the word came to the glazier. And he took it out on his wife, not on the gargoyle maker. And when finally the gargoyle maker heard about it, he took a hammer and went to one of the fine sections of the Madonna window and threw a hammer through it. And then he left the Ile. He fled Paris. And then he came back, and the glazier maker was waiting for him, and he threw him into the Seine. And according to the legend, Notre Dame appeared over him in the Seine as he was about to go down, and with that the glazier jumped into the Seine, saved the ugly gargoyle maker, and from that time on, they lived very happily. And it was said that the repaired window was far more beautiful than the original. That was just one tiny little incident in the building of the cathedral. And in those days, there were good men, there were bad men. One of the differences between those days and ours is that then the bad men knew they were bad men. You know, it's one thing to get off the road, and it's another thing to throw away the map. Those people never threw away the map. It's not often that governments ever get leadership that is vastly superior in moral quality to the masses of the people. Generally, they reflect the mediocrity of the people themselves. But in those days, contemporaneous with the building of this cathedral, the leader of the people, the king, was above the level of society. King St. Louis IX. When he was a little boy, his mother, Queen Blanche, used to take him in on Holy Thursday into the cathedral when the bishop washed the feet of the poor, and she made Louis wash the feet of the beggars in order that he would learn to love the poor. And then when he became king, he used to get up every midnight and go into the cathedral to pray. 4 o'clock, he was there again for matins, for early mass. And every single night, he used to have 200 beggars at his table. never invited those who could invite him back. One day a woman mocked him and said he was not fit to be a king. He said, "Lady, you are so right. I only wish that God would send someone in my place." But alongside of King St. Louis, there was also, a little later on, Francois Villon. Alongside of the doors of Notre Dame, he wrote his verses. He pilfered. He made love. He even murdered. The last poet of the Middle Ages, first poet of modern times. But he knew he was bad. And so he wrote out a poem to his mother, for his mother. And he asked his mother every day to go and kneel before the statue of Notre Dame and to pray for him, that eventually he would come back again to God. And those two represent some of the extremes of the Middle Ages. And in that great cathedral, too, Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette sponsored a great wedding. And 100 brides came in from one door of the cathedral, and 100 grooms came in from the other. And King, I was about to say St. Louis, he was not a saint, Louis XVI. And Louis XVI stamped the marriage contract of each with his seal on the hilt of his sword. Then, November the 10th, 1793, France was beginning to lose its faith, and then came the Revolution. And the revolutionists went to the Cathedral of Notre Dame, threw ropes and lassos about the statues of 28 kings on the outside, pulled them down from their niches, decapitated the stone kings, and then threw the torsos into the Seine. And then they changed the name of the Cathedral of Notre Dame to the Cathedral of Reason. And they brought in scenery from the opera. And they put the scenery behind the main altar of Notre Dame. It was the scenery of a vast mountain. And on top of that mountain was a statue dedicated to philosophy. And then with music, a ballet chorus comes in from what was originally the sacristy. When they finally danced about the sanctuary, Mademoiselle Aubry of the opera, who was called a masterpiece of nature, clothed in white with a cincture of blue, comes to the altar of Notre Dame for its final desecration. And everyone in the cathedral shouts out all praise to the goddess of reason. She has in her sword, in her hand, a kind of sword which symbolized the sword of truth or philosophy. Notre Dame became desecrated, and one little man by the name of Lenotre took down the beautiful image of Notre Dame that was dated from the middle of the 13th century and hid the statue for better days when it was finally replaced. And there too, in that same cathedral, Napoleon was crowned. The 13th Premier. Premier means cold, and it was cold on that December morning of 1804, 28 carriages, 6,000 foot soldiers, and 180 horses made up the cortege. And Pius VII came up from Rome to crown Napoleon. And the night before, he and Napoleon met. Now, the coronation ceremony is a very, very old one. Oil is used. There's great solemnity and sacredness about it. And the formula always used is coronet vos Deus. God crowned you. Napoleon said, we will not use that formula. We will use the formula accipe coronam, receive the crown. Pius VII said, no. All authority comes from God. As our blessed Lord said to Pilate, you would not have this power unless it were given to you from above. And even your authority, Napoleon, comes from God. Napoleon said it will be occupe corona. Pius VII refused. In the morning of the coronation, Pius VII was kept waiting there for about 2 hours, and finally Napoleon comes in. There comes the only moment of crowning, and as Pius VII is about to put the crown upon the head of Napoleon with the words, Coronet vos Deus, Napoleon snatches the crown from his own head, from his own hands, and puts it on his own head. Maybe you might be interested if the camera can come close enough. Can you come to my hand here? This is the ring that belonged to Pius VII, who crowned Napoleon in the Cathedral of Notre Dame on December the 2nd, 1804. It is not a precious ring as regards intrinsic worth, but it is a precious ring as regards its historical connotation. It was in that cathedral, too, that the great Lacordaire preached. And one understands how great preachers are made when you see how Lacordaire lived. Lacordaire used to have a little niche cut in the corner of his cell where he could look out on the tabernacle below, and from which he would derive the inspiration from his sermons. I've seen at the base of the Carme in Paris, it's still there, the cross on which Lacordaire used to rope himself, the crown of thorns that he used to put on his head on Good Friday morning in order to prepare himself by some kind of mortification for preaching the sermon of Good Friday afternoon in the Cathedral of Notre Dame. And so the events go on in this great palace of stone. It's a principle of life, what goes into a cathedral. There are two principles of life. One is the pyramid. Pyramid is constructed stone upon stone, one imposing itself upon the other, with a kind of an absolute equality in which there is no differentiation by function. And finally, at the peak of the pyramid is the keystone arch that rests upon them all and almost thrusts its weight upon them all. That keystone of the pyramid can be either a Khrushchev or a Bulganin. It makes no difference which. And then at the very base of the pyramid itself is death, a tomb, whether it be a Lenin or a Stalin. For there's no belief in any other kind of life in the pyramid principle. And in the cathedral, the stones are related one to another as regards their function. And the great arch has its foot on the earth and has its head in the heavens. And the cement is charity that holds the stone symbolic of persons together. And above all else in the cathedral, there is a freedom with fellowship, because the cathedral makes room for air, makes room for light, makes room for truth and love. On Palm Sunday, when our blessed Lord came into Jerusalem, there were those who bade the apostles to speak to the Savior. There was too much acclaim, too many hosannas in his honor, and our blessed Lord said, if these are silent, even the stones would cry out. And the stones did cry out. They burst into cathedrals like Notre Dame. And it was dedicated, yes, dedicated to a woman. But do not think that because it was dedicated to a woman that she's adored. She is not adored. She's not a goddess. She is human. Why then is there so much veneration and respect paid in a cathedral? Why is it dedicated to her? Because she is the rampart. She is the outpost. She is the human door by which divinity came into this earth. And that's why they regard her as someone who is to be revered. So long as the ramparts are... So the mother turned me on for the 4-year-old Becky. What do you think I was talking about that night? Melancholy and sadness. Becky, forgive me. This telecast is dedicated to youth. Now, there are many ways of treating the subject of youth, just as there are many ways of treating the subject of elephants. For example, if a German wrote about elephants, he probably would write a book entitled The Elephant and Its Philosophical Significance in 3 volumes with footnotes. The Soviet would write on the elephant and the war against imperialism. An American would write a book entitled The Elephant and Its Byproducts. And the French would write a paper-covered booklet entitled The Elephant and His Loves. So we have to choose one particular way of talking about youth, and here we begin with the lighter side. But it will develop into something much more important and serious, and this has to do with 2 different characteristics of youth. Certainly, one of the characteristics of youth is vitality, and the other is the emergence of personality. First of all, vitality. That manifests itself in physical enthusiasm, even intellectual enthusiasm. Did you ever notice how much emotion, for example, youth puts into arguments? Sometimes it's to make up for a want of logic and a want of knowledge, but that difficulty does not belong just to youth alone. I know of someone in my profession, really and truly. His sermon was found on the pulpit Monday morning by the janitor, and he had written on the side of a typewritten sermon, "Argument weak, shout like the deuce." So in addition to enthusiasm, there's also that which is so popularly associated with them called sex. This particular time, the girl no longer is interested in playing games. She now curls up with a romance. She begins to dream. She hears of the marriage of someone else. She projects herself into that marriage. And the boy begins to be conscious, too, of his maleness and the sense of his own incompleteness. He feels that he has to shave. He has a choice of buying the light Gillette for light beards, the medium Gillette for medium beards, and the heavy Gillette for heavy beards. He buys the heavy one. And then, in addition to this, there is, of course, the love of movement. Speed, not particular interest in where they are going, but certainly they are on their way. And the like to fracture time. We got in at 4 o'clock this morning. We had our breakfast in the diner out in the country. And music, well, there are music. Music, I think, appeals to 4 different parts of the human anatomy. For example, there's capital music that appeals to the head, which might be the music of Bach. Then there's the music, cordial music, that appeals to the heart, such as that of Chrysler. And then there's the music that might be called visceral. And then finally there's... Then there's pedal music, moves the feet. Well, youth is principally interested in the pedal and visceral music, only later on it gets up to the heart and to the head. Well, in addition to these expressions of vitality, there is also the emergence of personality. The youth now begins to feel that he's no longer part of a herd and part of a family. Incidentally, youth very often at this age shows his worst side at home and his best side away from home. His worst side at home because he has to fight for the emergence of his personality in order to convince his parents that he's no longer a baby. Begins to call the father the old man. The mother, she says she no longer can understand her daughter. And then in addition to that, there's much daydreaming. Scripture says that the young men dream dreams. The old men see visions. The young look forward. the old look backwards. Laudator temporis acti, said Horace of the old. That which is past is always the best. But this looking forward to youth is personality, life's work, vocation. It's good and it's right. But of course, youth must remember that youth is the morning, and age is the evening of life. Those who have had the evening have already had the morning, but those who have had the morning had not yet had the evening. You think your parents are behind the times. Remember, that's what your parents told their parents. And someday somebody's going to tell you you're behind the times. Now, these are two different aspects of youth, but it is possible now to regulate youth in different ways. For example, one can regulate youth and life on the basis of what might be called the pleasure principle, as Freud called it. Or one can, taking this other aspect of youth, regulate life on the basis of character. Those who develop their lives solely on the basis of pleasure say, the only reason we're here is to have a good time. Get as much fun out of life as you possibly can. Those who start with this principle are concerned with values, with goals, with destinies, and why we're living. This is the answer to the question, what then? The young man is told, he's asked, what are you going to be? I'm going to be a doctor. What then? I'm going to begin to practice. What then? I'm going to marry. What then? I'm going to raise a family. What then? I'm going to make money and retire at 78. What then? It's that last what then we have to start with. Now, are these two different principles contradictory? No. But suppose, however, one starts with the pleasure principle. What happens? The development of character loses its urgency. If youth starts with the idea that we are here in this world solely to have a good time, there is danger that the giving away to the emotions, to sentiments, the lower part of our being, will begin to cloud our reason. We lose the capacity to think clearly because we are influenced by the way we live. A robber has to defend his philosophy of robbery, his robberies. Murder is crime. And after a while, there begins to be an adjustment to our behavior. And the result is that there may develop skepticism and doubt. Youth may even become atheistic. These are not intellectual positions, and let no educators believe that they are. They are just simply moral positions. They result from behavior. And then, too, one of the dangers of this pleasure principle is the pleasures are going to decrease as time goes on. Suppose I had the habit of, when I was talking to you, of just doing that. Well, you would say after the first 178 broadcasts, isn't that a strange habit that he has? And then if I were to impress you with the next 178 telecasts, I would have to do something like this. And then when we got into 400, I would have to do like this. So we lose the capacity for enjoyment as time goes on. And then we begin to suffer ennui and boredom and feel that life is not worth living. That's one of the grave dangers of starting with the pleasure principle. And it's rather difficult when youth starts with that to ever rationalize them and reason them away from it, because they justify giving way to their emotions. I believe that one of the best approaches that has been developed was by a professor of philosophy at the University of Cambridge, C.S. Lewis. He wrote a book that went through 25 editions in 5 years called Screwtape Letters. Read it. It's a marvelous book. It's a series of correspondence or letters that were exchanged between an old uncle devil in hell, whose name is Screwtape, Screwtape, and his younger nephew devil on earth, whose name is Wormwood. Wormwood is working on the soul of a young man. He's trying to win him over through the diabolical ways of living. And in this correspondence, the wiser old devil in hell counsels Wormwood as to how he is approached to win over this youth. Every now and then there enters into the correspondence a warning from Screwtape about the enemy, and to beware of the tactics of the enemy. The enemy, of course, is God. As a result, in this work, you get a great deal of spiritual advice upside down, because it's always the devil that's telling you what to do, and you're surprised when you read the book as how often you follow the devil's advice. For example, at the very beginning of the book, Screwtape gets after Wormwood. He says, "Wormwood, you're a fool. You are trying to convince this youth that materialism is right and true. You are even attempting to prove that materialism is true." Screwtape says, "Wormwood, never do that. Remember that proof belongs to the enemy. Remember that it is the enemy who speaks of a thing being true. When you deal with youth, never, never argue about true and false. All that you must do when you talk to youth is get him to ask, is it modern? Is it progressive? Make him fearful that it's reactionary, or maybe it's medieval, and he will steer away from the idea, but never speak of truth." Then he says, get the youth to read cheap poets and fifth-rate novelists. And then you'll grow up with the idea that all kinds of repression are wrong, that marriage was never meant to be one and enduring. And finally, Wormwood's not doing too well with the young man. And eventually he gets on the subject of sex. And old Screwtape said, "Wormwood," he said, "we change styles of sex. Centuries go on." He said a few centuries ago, he said, we created the mode, the particular type of woman that was desirable was the statuesque, aristocratic type. Now, Screwtape says, we've left the age of waltz. We are now in the age of jazz. And the woman now whom we idolize is the woman who very closely resembles a boy in looks. She's very thin. One of the great advantages of this is we make her fearful of growing old. And then she's also the type that cannot bear children. That helps us very much. And finally, old Screwtape gives the last counsel, and he says, cultivate noise. He said, there is not an inch of infernal space, there is not a moment of infernal time that is not filled with noise. We have to have noise in order to drown out all of our dismal worries and anxieties and fears. And he said, on earth they must have noise too, noise to drown out the melodies and the silences of heaven. And we do not yet have enough noise on earth. I am almost in despair. It's a great spiritual book for youth. It will warn them of the danger of the primacy of the pleasure principle. Now suppose you start with the other principle. Suppose you start with the character principle. Then you begin with discovering the purpose of life. There has never been a system of education, and there will never be a system of education equal to that, which takes a child 4 or 5 or 6 years of age and turns him into an Aristotle or a Plato and makes him answer at the very beginning of life the question, why were you made? And there are millions of children in this world who are answering that question with, I was made to be happy. And the way to be happy is to know truth and to love goodness and to seek a life that is enduring and eternal. In other words, I am made for God in the fullness of His revelation and all that is. When a youth starts with that plan of life, then everything else fits into place. The biological, the economic, the social, and pleasure. Then the youth begins to understand these instincts. Certainly a youth has great passions and emotions, and they are right, and they are good. And let no one ever say that they are evil, because they are divinely implanted. Almighty God has put into every youth in the world two great hungers. One, a hunger for food, and the other, the hunger for a mate. And God implanted these impulses and hungers simply because, first, individual life had to be preserved by eating, and secondly, social life had to be preserved, humanity, by birth and by generation. And Almighty God, in order to ensure the preservation of individual life and the preservation of social life, associated great and intense pleasures with both of these impulses, in order to be sure that the ends of man would be achieved. Let no one therefore ever tell you, and we say these instincts are wrong. They are not wrong. They are not wrong any more than the instinct for play is wrong, or the instinct for pleasure, or the instinct for happiness. What is wrong is to say, well, we have these impulses, and we must follow our nature, must we not? Yes, we must follow our nature. But our nature is not the nature of a pig. Pig will use certain instincts according to season and laws implanted by nature. But we are to use these instincts according to reason and according to will and according to the final purpose of life. When youth understands that, then he will not fall prey to a very false doctrine which is upsetting youth and upsetting the world, namely believing that man is to be understood in terms of sex. He is not. Sex is to be understood in terms of man. You might just as well say to you, my voice is to be understood in terms of the larynx. There's something else in my voice and the words that come out than the larynx. And so sex is associated with love and is related to the whole personality. When youth understands this, the final goal of living, then he takes these God-given pleasures and enjoys them in the way that God intended. Then his life is normal. Then he's not suffering from ennui and suffering from boredom, beginning to feel that life is something at which we may sneer. If youth today is protesting against the older generation, it's not because the youth is wrong, it's because the older generation has not given him that culture and those principles which youth needs and which youth believes that it should have. Why should we always, when we think of youth, immediately begin talking about juvenile delinquency? Why is it that we always pick the worst that youth shows instead of the best? When we study art, do we look at the crudest manifestations of art? Or when we study music, the babblings of a child, do we not always look to the best? Why is it that immediately juvenile delinquency comes to our mind when we speak of youth, if it is not because crime makes better news than virtue? And why does crime make better news than virtue? Because a civilization that has a sense of guilt, even though it be unconscious, likes to read about how wicked other people are. It makes them feel more innocent. Why not look to the best that is in youth? What is the best? I will tell you what's the best in youth. And this is the reason of hope for youth. Every year, there are tens of thousands and hundreds of thousands of youths who give themselves completely and totally to God. I wonder if there's anything more beautiful in all this world than a young girl full of charm, full of loveliness, in the very bloom and blossom, springtime of life, taking all of this and consecrating it to the origin and source of all beauty, God Himself. Should we despair of youth when we know that there are tens of thousands of young men full of enthusiasm, full of life, full of passion, full of wild furies that take all of these things and tame them and discipline them and then bring them to the very source of life and love, which is God Himself in one great passionless passion and wild tranquility? Why, that's the source of goodness that there is in this world. There are indeed many in this world who give their old bones to God. Of course, God takes their old bones, but it's much more beautiful to think of the young giving their life to God. And after all, they are the ones that are always young, because how do we know when anyone is young? By closeness to the source of life. But there's another source of life than parents, namely God. And therefore, the closer we get to God, the younger we become. The more we live in union with Him, the more fresh we become, until we reach our birthday, which is the day that we are united with love. No wonder our Lord said that no old people enter the kingdom of heaven unless you become as children.
People of all faiths recognize Bishop Fulton J. Sheen as one of the greatest communicators of the 20th century. He was born in El Paso, Illinois, in May of 1896. As a young boy, he knew he wanted to be a priest. He served as an altar boy at St. Mary's Cathedral in Peoria, Illinois. At St. Viator College, his education and debating skills taught him the skills he used throughout his life. His unique ability at being natural and at ease in front of any audience